Hello, and today we're going to be looking at Edexcel 1 to 9 GCSE revision, Paper 2, Cold War, and we're going to be focusing on the end of the Cold War, Topic 3, 1968 to 1991. So these acronyms that we've been looking at throughout the last couple of videos are really helpful for A, remembering all of the content involved in the Cold War, and B, remembering how all of the different events are linked. Today we've got 4 acronyms: ASSIST, which is for Detente, the period of temporary peace between America and Russia; Afghanistan, which is for Afghanistan; Gorby, which is Gorbachev's new thinking; and peace, the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. The Cold War begins in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, whereby both sides are set apart both ideologically, economically and politically, and over the next 20 years America and Russia are embroiled in a Cold War. Now, the period of Detente is where they're not working against each other, but rather working with each other. Therefore, that's why we've chosen the acronym ASSIST. A is for Asia. President Nixon visits China various times in the 1960s in what is known as the ping pong diplomacy. The American ping pong team actually goes to play table tennis in China. China is welcomed back into the United Nations, and this suggests that there could be a future positive relationship for America and Russia, the Soviet Union, as America is willing to have friendly relationships with communist China. However, many people believe that the ping pong diplomacy with China is just a publicity stunt and probably more likely to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union than it is to bring the Soviet Union on board. A more genuine attempt to assist each other is in space with the Apollo-Soyuz mission. After the tension involved in the space race and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides begin to try and work together in space. The space race began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite into outer space. What then happened over the next 5 years is that both sides were competing to get a man into the Earth's atmosphere and then a man onto the moon, which the Americans did, allegedly, with Neil Armstrong. The Apollo-Soyuz test was a symbol of the policy of Detente, that the two superpowers were trying to work together in space rather than working against each other. Whilst America improving relationship with China in the 60s and the joint space mission in 1975 were largely propaganda stunts and not really having that much of an effect on the Soviet Union's relationship with America, SALT I was a huge step forward in trying to find peace between the two superpowers. The SALT I agreements in 1972, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, had the idea of trying to remove nuclear weapons and bombers, particularly intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. It was an extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and was signed after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was essentially trying to end or trying to limit the arms race, which was good intentions by both. The International Accords, or the Helsinki Conference of 1975, should have been the start of friendly relationships between America and Russia, and many people believe that it was the high point of Detente. Both sides agreed to recognise the current borders of European countries and agreed to help each other economically and technologically, which benefited the Soviet Union. Now, America weren't willing to give this away for free, therefore they demanded that all countries, including the Soviet Union, respect the human rights and freedoms of all countries involved, which means freedom of speech, freedom to vote, which obviously the Soviet Union weren't very happy about. Now, like SALT I and the Helsinki Accords, SALT II was another example of there being a better relationship between America and the Soviet Union, an event which led to less tension, as both sides agreed to try and remove or limit their production of long-range missiles, including the newly developed MRVs, ICBMs and SLBMs. However, what's quite frustrating for you as a student and for most of the world at the time is that all of these negotiations and all of this hard work was undone very, very quickly when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. To be honest, even before that, there was tension between America and the USSR due to them being on different sides of the same war. It happened in Vietnam, it happened in the Arab and Israeli war. Therefore, the invasion of Afghanistan was simply the tipping point in relationships. Acronym 2 is Afghanistan, which is quite long and quite difficult to remember, so we're going to split this up into 2 sections. Afghan is the events leading up to the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Istan being the consequences. I would suggest that you try to memorise the first part of the acronym and then the second, and then join the 2 together. So Afghan stands for a buffer zone, friends, ground advisors, hatred for Hafizullah, angry Muslims, and nativity invasion. We still have quite a lot to get through, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into the invasion of Afghanistan. There is, however, another video available on my YouTube channel, so please feel free to watch that as well. Remember, like and subscribe. So A is for a buffer zone between the Middle East and the Soviet Union, which is what the USSR wanted to create by trying to get Afghanistan to become communist. It was also important for their future plans of expanding into the Middle East, considering their vast resources of oil, minerals and precious metals in that region. It was also a defence mechanism against the spreading of Islamic extremism coming up through the Middle East. Noor Tariqi became the president of Afghanistan in 1978 after a communist revolution. This was great news for the Soviet Union, who decided to embark on a friendship treaty with their communist neighbour and promised to give continued support in that region. Oh, friend! Oh, communist friend! Oh, socialism! Oh, friend! Oh, communist friend! Oh. The inhabitants of Afghanistan, especially those living in the countryside, were mainly Muslim. Therefore, they were unhappy with many of Noor Tariqi's communist reforms, such as the confiscation of land. The Soviet Union felt that it was important to support their new socialist ally, and in 1978 sent in 5,000 Soviet troops, otherwise known as ground advisors, to try and protect communist interests. Tariqi was later assassinated by his second-in-command, Hafizullah Amin, and he very quickly attracted the hatred of many people in Afghanistan. He installed a military dictatorship, a police state, and even oppressed Muslims for following their own religion. Many militia, spelled M-I-L-I-T-I-A, started to spring up in Afghanistan, again in the countryside where there was quite a lot of traditional Muslim communities, and they felt that the new communist regime was an attack on their religion. Therefore, they started to wage what was called a jihad, a holy war, and the warriors in this war became known as the Mujahideen. The Soviet Union became very anxious because they felt that they could not control Hafizullah Amin. There were also fears that he was talking to the USA. Therefore, on the 24th of December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, installed their own puppet leader called Babrak Kamal, and over the next 10 years the Soviet Union were invested in a very damaging and an unwinnable war with Afghanistan. By 1980, the American people were very frustrated that their government were allowing the Soviet Union to overtake them and essentially to invade Afghanistan without any reason. Therefore, the American government were more than willing to support what would later become quite an extremist Islamic group in the Mujahideen. In 1980, President Carter released his own version of the Truman Doctrine, the Carter Doctrine, whereby he stated that any attempt by an outside force, e.g. the Soviet Union, to try and take over the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, Afghanistan, that kind of area, would be met with military action by America. SALT II was officially cancelled, and this essentially led to an end in the friendly relationship, Detente, between America and the Soviet Union. Due to American funding of the Mujahideen, the Soviet Union really struggled in their fight against Afghanistan. They were completely unprepared Trying to take tanks into a mountainous region just simply did not work. Instead, they resorted to firebombing villages, killing thousands of innocent people, spending millions and millions on essentially a fruitless war. And many people in the Soviet Union and modern-day Russia believe this to be their own version of Vietnam. The tension really bubbled between the two superpowers in 1980 when America boycotted the Moscow Olympics. They refused to give Olympians their passports, or suggested that Olympians' passports would be taken away from them. And in retaliation, the Soviet Union and many other communist countries boycotted the Los Angeles Olympics. This was essentially a war of words. However, it marked a new point, or a new low point, in relationships between the Soviet Union. The end of Detente, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the creation of new nuclear weapons such as the Pershing II really did worsen relationships between America and the Soviet Union, to the point where in 1983 we came very, very close to World War III. Without going into too much detail, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the alliance of capitalist countries underneath America, have a set of war games like practice military drills underneath the code name Able Archer. And in 1983, these practices, these mock wars, so to speak, were taken so seriously by the Soviets that they actually thought that America was preparing for war, and both sides had their finger on the button. This increased tension was just another consequence, another symptom of the Reagan Doctrine and Reagan's appointment as American president in 1981. He increased spending on nuclear weapons by 13%. There was also development of the neutron bomb and the Star Wars project, which tried to put lasers in space, therefore breaking the space treaty. All of this led to much tension between America and... So like I said before, it's probably easier if you learn the AFGHAN section first, which is a buffer zone, friends, ground advisors, hatred for Hafizullah, angry Muslims, Nativity invasion, followed by Islamic extremism, Soviet struggling, triathlon, which is about the Olympics, Able Archer, and New Cold War. The beginning of the end of the Cold War begins with Gorbachev and his new thinking, his new approach to the Soviet Union and relationships between the USA and the communist countries. And for this sequence of events, we would use the acronym GORBY. G for Glasnost, open-mindedness. O, occupation of Afghanistan. R, restructuring or perestroika. B for Brezhnev. And I, the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. When Gorbachev became premier in 1985, he had inherited a broken Soviet Union. The economy was in vast decline. There was corruption within the Politburo, hence the reason why one of Gorbachev's first reforms was the Glasnost policy, a policy of open-mindedness. This was an attempt to bring in more democracy, have a smaller influence of the secret police, and a softer Soviet Union. Gorbachev and many other people in the Soviet Union realised that the occupation of Afghanistan was a war that would never end. The Soviet Union looked very bad in the eyes of the world for trying to control this people. Most people inside the Soviet Union did not support the war, and as more and more Soviet soldiers were being killed or wounded as the war dragged on, Gorbachev would refer to the Soviet war of Afghanistan as a bleeding wound. Therefore, at Malta in 1989, they decided to put unsuccessful economic policies such as collectivization and Comecon meant that the Soviet Union's economy had been in rapid decline for a long number of years. Therefore, Gorbachev's perestroika policy, or his restructure policy, would include more capitalist practices of America. After all, they were one of the richest countries on the planet, and he promised more cooperation with the West. The Brezhnev Doctrine in 1965 stated that any communist country that tried to move away from the Soviet Union would be dealt with by military force. Gorbachev moved away from the Brezhnev Doctrine as part of his Glasnost and his perestroika policies, and countries such as Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary and East Germany began to elect their own non-communist parties and began to move away from the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's true masterpiece, and probably the main reason why he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. And this was a consequence of 4 different conferences whereby the main aim was to try and remove the nuclear weapons, which had been the main cause of tension between America and Russia for the last 40 years. All of Gorbachev's reforms, or his new thinking policies, led to the end of the Cold War in 1991, and for this we use the acronym PEACE. P stands for Poland, E, East Germany, A, alliances disappear, C, communists angry, E, end of USSR. P stands for Poland. Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary all begin to install non-communist governments. First it is Czechoslovakia with the Velvet Revolution, followed by Poland with the Solidarity Movement. All of these leads to borders opening all across the eastern Germany, and without any cohesion, the Warsaw Pact collapses. The Berlin Wall was put up on the 12th of August 1961, and for the next 30 or so years stood as a permanent symbol of division between America and the Soviet Union. On the 9th of November 1989, when the head of the East German Communist Party announced that citizens of Western Germany could cross the border whenever they pleased, that night ecstatic crowds swarmed the wall and the wall was pulled down. David Hasselhoff, the true hero of the Cold War, performed Looking for Freedom on the Berlin Wall New Year's Eve 1989 and was a symbol of reunification of Germans both East and West, and is probably the greatest song of all time. I've been looking for freedom, I've been looking so long. And with that, the alliance system began to break down. The Soviet Union had lost 3 important allies in Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary in quick succession, and many others began to declare independence. As a result, the Warsaw Pact dissolved on July 1991. Many hardcore communists were incredibly angry with Gorbachev, as they felt that he had single-handedly destroyed communism and the Soviet Union. The leader of Russia at the time, Boris Yeltsin, tried to show his support for Gorbachev. However, Gorbachev was forced to resign on the 25th of December 1991, and officially the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended on Christmas Day. However, the true end to the Cold War had already happened at the Malta Conference in 1989, whereby, in the spirit of cooperation between America and the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev promised that he would never start a hot war against the West. Thank you very much for listening. So just a quick recap of what we've just covered. The period of détente between the USA and the Soviet Union, you can use assist. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, you can use Afghanistan. Gorbachev's new thinking can be remembered using Gorby, and the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War can be remembered or can be revised using peace. Thanks again. Cheers. Bye.